Whisky has been made here on the banks of the River Annan since 1836, when George Donald, a former excise officer from Elgin, established Annandale Distillery. George was obviously a canny businessman because he managed to persuade a syndicate of local business owners to fund his project. But he eventually bought them out, and together with various of his 13 children, the Donald family produced whisky here at Annandale for almost 50 years. Around the distillery there was and still is an abundance of peat, which, as you'll hear shortly, was the principal fuel used for drying malted barley back in the day. And also there's a whiff of salt perhaps from the nearby Solway Firth to add that certain je ne sais quoi to the flavour of the whisky. And of great commercial importance, Annan has good transport connections, originally by sea from the port of Annan, but eventually by rail, which meant that Annandale Distillery could reach out well beyond the local market to sell its whisky. And as you'll hear shortly, these sea routes and rail links would come to play a very significant role in the fate of Annandale Distillery. After George Donald passed away, the distillery was taken over by Liverpool wine and spirits merchant John Sykes Gardner in 1885. During the George Donald era, there had been huge leaps forward in technology. So Gardner invested heavily, making significant upgrades to both plant and buildings, and this included the installation of a steam engine to supplement the water wheel that turned the mill that ground the barley. But sadly, John Sykes Gardner's tenure at Annandale lasted only about 10 years, cut short by the untimely death of his son, who had helped him run the distillery. So in 1895, ownership of the distillery passed on to none other than John Walker and Sons of Kilmarnock, otherwise known as the very famous Johnnie Walker. Now, we don't know for certain why Johnnie Walker bought Annandale Distillery, but one interesting theory put forward by the late legendary whisky guru Dr. Jim Swan was that Annandale would have served as a conveniently located source of smoky peaty whisky for Johnnie Walker to use in its increasingly popular range of blended Scotch whiskies. In spite of the obvious advantages of producing smoky peaty whisky at Annandale, Johnnie Walker's tenure was relatively short, largely because of the First World War, where priority was given to feeding the nation rather than producing barley for brewing and distilling. So having limped through World War I, production at Annandale Distillery finally ceased in December 1918. The freehold was eventually acquired by the Robinson family in about 1925. Now, the Robinsons were wealthy local business people famed for producing Provost porridge oats, then the #2 brand of porridge oats in Scotland. Fast forward to 2006, and it was in the pages of Brian Townsend's book Scotch Mist that David Thompson, who grew up in nearby Dumfries, and Teresa Church discovered Annandale Distillery. Passionate about local history, the pair couldn't resist at taking a look at the site. The buildings were in terrible condition, overgrown, dilapidated, and in the case of the bonded warehouses, home to livestock. But their imaginations had been captured by the strangely isolated chimney, the stunning pagoda roof building that had once been the malt kiln, and by the hidden beauty of those unloved sandstone buildings. By 2007, Annandale Distillery was theirs. Before work commenced, Glasgow University Archaeological Research Division was brought in to excavate the site. Their discovery of the original subterranean stillhouse, which explained the standalone chimney, was considered to be a significant find in terms of the industrial archaeology of Scotland. It was agreed that the archaeology would be preserved in the current courtyard and left open for visitors to enjoy. But this meant an expensive change of plan for Theresa and David, because the new stillroom would obviously have to be sited elsewhere. Back in the Donald, Gardner and Walker eras, Annandale Distillery would have malted its own barley. This would have taken place in what's now the Maltings coffee shop, and also on the floor immediately above, as these were the original malting floors. Now, because transportation was a big issue back then, the barley would have been grown locally, although the quality would probably have been quite poor because the local climate is just too damp for growing barley.
you.